Hey there, my name is Phil, and today I want to tell you what happened to Hameact when I intentionally let a Weretortoise loose on my dwarves. Hameact was my fort that I played to get back into Dwarf Fortress after a long break. There was nothing too remarkable about it, I just wanted to make a fort that was contained mostly on one floor. It had 2 popular taverns and enough temples to please any worshipper. Things were running smoothly, but as we all know, smooth-running fortresses rarely make good stories. I was ready to retire the fort and move on, but then I had a fun idea. A few months ago, a Weretortoise had found its way to my fort, but luckily I caught it in a cage trap near the entrance. If you didn't know, werebeasts can spread their condition via biting. This causes the infected dwarf to transform into that werebeast upon the full moon, assuming they can survive that long. Once transformed, they're hostile to all non-werebeasts until they transform back. They'll fight and bite any dwarves nearby, spreading the infection. Normally, the solution is to expel any dwarves that have been infected, but I wanted to see if I could make a fort entirely consisting of weretortoises. I had no idea what to expect, but the result was quite spectacular. Before I unleashed the infection upon my dwarves, I decided to expand my catacombs. I expected a lot of my residents to die, and the least I could do for my poor citizens was give them a proper burial. I dug out about 70 extra rooms, made doors and coffins for them, and designated them as tombs. Part of me wondered if my dwarves expected anything to happen as they constructed these tombs. Surely they felt a sense of impending doom, because I undoubtedly did. Once I was done constructing the extra tombs, I placed the cage containing the naked Atir Okmamuz in the middle of one of my taverns, hoping that would allow him to cause as much damage as possible before he was taken out. Werebeasts are pretty strong against unarmed dwarves, but they're no match for the trained monster slayers that were hanging out in my tavern. I connected the cage to a lever and waited for the next full moon to come. Finally, the full moon came, and Atir the peasant transformed. The moment he was released, he jumped on the closest dwarf he could see, and every dwarf in the tavern retaliated in kind. He was quickly defeated, but not before biting 4 dwarves, a glassmaker, 2 crafts dwarves, and a visiting baroness consort. The curse started spreading. My injured citizens rushed to the hospital to have their wounds cleaned and sutured. I had skilled hospital staff, so their flesh wounds were nicely treated, but the Weretortoise curse was incurable. Things were quiet after the initial attack, and the fortress went back to business as usual until the next full moon. When the full moon came, the 4 infected dwarves transformed. 2 of them were in the tavern, which exploded into massive brawl. This time, the damage was palpable. 8 dwarves perished, as well as 2 of the tortoises. I then realized that my hospital was severely under-equipped to handle all the injured citizens, and I hurriedly ordered for more beds to be made so injured dwarves could rest. I didn't know it at the time, but this was the beginning of the end of Hameact. When the 3rd full moon came, 12 inhabitants transformed into weretortoises. 2 tortoises were in my tavern, the Fruits of Coal, but were quickly dispatched by the armed humans that I allowed to stay in my fort to eradicate monsters. Finally, the fact that they never left the tavern paid off. Did they know that the real monsters were among us? Or were they just staying in my fort to eat and drink for free? The other tavern, the Rough Breakfast, had a similar encounter. 2 tortoises transformed but were slain by armed humans, but not before taking out a dwarf. Another tortoise transformed in the corridor, but was struck down by a military dwarf that luckily happened to be nearby at the time. However, the worst attacks happened outside of the taverns. 3 dwarves that were resting in the hospital transformed and began mauling the staff and any other unfortunate citizens that hadn't been infected. Another tortoise outside attacked a group of unarmed dwarves, killing them one by one. In the smelting workshop, a tortoise slaughtered the smith dwarves. So much was happening that I couldn't even keep up with it. Finally, the full moon was over, and the single surviving tortoise transformed back into a dwarf. Hameact lost 30 citizens in a single night, and another 35 were injured. Even after the uproar, more dwarves succumbed to their injuries as the hospital instantly filled up with suffering dwarves. Bodies were strewn about the fort. Any dwarf that caught sight of the carnage was nauseated to the point of vomiting, making the scene even more disgusting. Any healthy survivors started carrying corpses to the tombs and cleaning the blood and vomit off the floor. While the fort was still recovering from the tortoise plague, a small battalion of goblins invaded the fort to lay siege. I sounded the alarm, but many of my citizens were outside washing themselves in the river. Bracing myself for the worst, I called upon whatever was left of my militia squad to defend the fort from the intruders. The last of the stragglers was Rith Ishlavmavuz, a siege engineer who was already walking on a crutch. He hobbled his way to the hatch, trying to dodge arrows as best as he could with one good leg. He managed to enter the tunnel, but the goblins pursued and filled his back with arrows. Luckily, the goblins were caught in my cage traps, and the siege broke, leaving one last goblin to retreat from the fort. We now had another problem. Any visitors that were slain did not get assigned tombs, and their bodies had started to rot, spewing miasma into the air. I decided to close my taverns and temples to all non-citizens in an attempt to protect any ignorant visitors from coming to my dying fort. Honestly, I didn't know what to do with the corpses, so I just designated them as garbage so my dwarves could at least remove the source of miasma in the fort. Sorry for the unceremonious burial, guys. The fourth full moon was upon us, even though Hameact had not recovered from the last full moon. This time, 18 dwarves transformed, most of whom were resting in the hospital. They started attacking the non-infected dwarves unconscious in their beds, slaughtering them before they could even wake up. Maybe those victims got off easy. At this point, there were much fewer armed dwarves, but it seemed like my citizens were more adept at fighting because there were so many dead tortoises randomly throughout Hameact. All but 2 of the tortoises were slain, but not before taking out 40 citizens and injuring another 25. My hospital staff was taken out, and in a desperate act, I tried to replace them with anyone that had relevant skills. Nearly a third of the fort was incapacitated, and my productivity dropped to almost nothing. I realized the tombs were all filled up, so I designated more rooms to be carved out, which never actually happened because there was only one miner left to dig them out. With no more tombs to hold my dead, bodies were just left on the floor to rot, releasing even more miasma into the air. Time was still passing, inching toward the next full moon. How many would transform this time? My plan to turn everyone into a tortoise was not going well. I highly underestimated the lethality of a werebeast towards a regular citizen and vice versa. Not only was I losing dwarves, but I was also losing infected dwarves as well. For some crazy reason, a wave of migrants arrived. I guess the stories of the horror within Hameact had not reached the mountain home. These foolish dwarves made the worst mistake of their lives. Again, the full moon was upon us, and 25 inhabitants transformed into weretortoises. As per usual, my hospital was a scene of carnage, but there were enough tortoises around the fort that were able to isolate and kill their victims. This was the deadliest attack of all. Over 70 of my population was slain by the beasts. However, this time, not many of the weretortoises were killed, transforming back into their dwarven form when the full moon ended. Perhaps my goal was possible? Werebeasts are not hostile toward other werebeasts, so if it came to the point where every citizen was infected, full moons would become relatively peaceful events, and hypothetically, my dwarves could continue life as normal in between their transformations. Well, as normal as possible after all the corpses are cleaned up. Not much happened after the full moon. 10 citizens were injured with no functional hospital. The rest of the dwarves were too miserable to do any work anyway. My catacomb expansion was still unfinished, with not a single coffin having been placed. Corpses of dwarves, humans, elves, and animals were everywhere, as well as their dropped belongings. I really felt bad for the last 39 citizens, and even considered abandoning the fort to ruin to end their suffering, but I decided to stay strong until the bitter end. Who knows, maybe there could be a good end to this harrowing tale. At this point, weretortoises have outnumbered regular dwarves. As usual, my hospital was a site of carnage, but some dwarves luckily avoided being seen because they were behind closed doors. Other dwarves were not so lucky. One poor soul made the mistake of visiting the Baroness for a meeting, only to see that she was a rabid tortoise who chased him down and killed him. I couldn't bear to watch. 15 of the non-infected were killed during this night. Hameact was in ruin. The only positive thing was the fact that some of the bodies had finally decomposed into skeletons and would not be releasing miasma anymore. This was the point when I realized that transforming destroys your clothing, and all of my dwarves were running around naked. Oops. This time, there was less carnage than usual because there were so few uninfected dwarves. A few dwarves were slain in the hospital, as the doctor that I hastily appointed turned out was cursed, and upon transforming, he attacked and killed the patients he was supposed to be helping. Tortoises scoured the fort for dwarves, but fortunately were not able to find any. we had dropped down to 15 citizens, most of them naked, unaware, and running around doing random jobs throughout the fort. What a miserable scene. If you take anything away from this tale, make sure you contain or expel your bitten dwarves when a werebeast comes to your fort. I wonder if I've doomed this entire world through cursed visitors. Could someone have visited, been bitten, left to go to another site, and transformed there to spread the infection there as well? I'll have to find out next time I make a fort in this world. Anyway, let's fast forward to the next full moon. We've almost achieved a perfect 100% Weretortoise rate. Again, the full moon was mostly quiet because there were so few uninfected dwarves. Unfortunately, I couldn't catch the couple of deaths that happened, but the tortoises ran around looking for victims. 4 dwarves fell this time around. Every surviving dwarf was either injured or naked. At this point, I just let the fort idle. I had a sneaking suspicion that tortoises were fighting each other too because I was losing a few of them every time. Suddenly, I got an alert. Cavern dwellers were attacking. Luckily, I had some cage traps placed near the entrance of my caverns, but I quickly realized there were more invaders than there were cage traps. One poor human wandered in to get a drink of water, but was caught and killed by the lizard men. Another human walked right past them for some reason. Thanks for slaying those monsters, buddy. Helpless, I watched as they climbed my stairs and started searching the remains of my fort for dwarves. All of my dwarves were naked and unarmed, so they would be easy pickings for the invaders. The only way they'd survive is to transform into their were form. We were so close to a full moon, and I anxiously watched the date, waiting for it to come. The full moon came, and the tortoises transformed and started running towards the invaders instead of away. However, while an unarmed dwarf is an easy target for a weretortoise, an armed and skilled invader is not. They were easily taken out by the lizard men. With almost all of the citizens dead, I decided to release the forgotten beast that I had trapped a while ago. Maybe they would be able to take out the invaders. I got distracted at seeing the lizard men slaughter all of my livestock, and barely caught a group of them ganging up on and taking down the forgotten beast. There were only 3 citizens left, one of whom being my infected Baroness, who survived only by staying inside of her office. She was eventually found out by the roaming lizard men, and while she tried to run from them, she too was killed. There was only one dwarf left, a vampire that I had discovered and trapped many few years ago. He drained the blood of one of my citizens, and I decided to leave him locked up, doomed to spend eternity in his tiny room, because I figured that would be a fate worse than death. I have very little sympathy for vampires. At least he got to be the mayor, though. With that, I finally retired the fortress. My plan to have a fort consisting entirely of weretortoises was a total failure, but an interesting failure. Even if the cavern invaders didn't kill off the remaining dwarves, what was there to do with the shell of the previous fortress? Any migrants that were foolish enough to come to the fort would be slaughtered upon the next full moon anyways. I did learn my lesson though. Werebeasts are nothing to be taken lightly, and I'll make sure to beast-proof the entrance of every fort I ever make from now on. Thanks for watching my tale of the Fall of Hameact.